Sometimes beautiful irreverence is necessary. Sometimes it may be desirable to make good trouble. Sometimes it is very, very crucial for individuals holding high office to be prepared to look outside of the box, especially if the box has been in place for a little while. And with the interest of the people at the center, irreverence can probably lead to good results because we live in changing times. In or around 2001, the government of Jamaica granted a license to generate electricity, generate, transmit, distribute, and supply electricity for public and private purposes within Jamaica, subject to some conditions. As I've been at pains to explain on this and any other program on which I speak, we need to understand that things happen in countries because of laws that have been passed by the parliament. So in Jamaica, we have an electric lighting act. This electric lighting act was passed in May 1890. It has had several amendments since then, but under Section 3 of the Electric Lighting Act, it gives the minister the power to license any local authority or any company or person to supply electricity under the Electric Lighting Act for public or private purposes within any area. And that license has to make recommendations and regulations rather as to the limits within which and the conditions under which a supply of electricity is to be provided. And it needs to talk about the enforcement of performance by the licensees or whatever duties they have to supply electricity. And it needs to deal as well with the issue of the revocation of the license where licensees fail to perform their duties. So with that power, a license has been granted, which has resulted in a monopolistic situation for the generation, transmission, distribution, and supply of electricity. There has been some tweaking in years subsequent to the passage in 2001, and we will probably get through some of those. Now, the Jamaica Public Service, about 19-point-something% of it is still owned by the Jamaican government. You may recall an entity called Mirant, and up to 2007, Mirant owned about 80% of the shares in JPS. They were able to sell the 80% shares in JPS in or around mid-2007. But that could only happen with the required consent of the government. At the moment, as I understand it, there are 3 shareholders in the Jamaica Public Service. One being Marubeni, pursuant to the purchase of Miran's shares in 2007. But there's also the Korean East-West Company, which has... So the Marubeni share is now split. 40% remaining with Marubeni and 40% to the Korean East-West Company. And the Jamaican government retains this approximately 20% of the shares. Two of the biggest challenges facing Jamaica for decades, two of them have been the exceedingly high crime rate, particularly murder rates, and the exceedingly high cost of energy. There were a lot of companies that had business establishments here and which, based on their recurrent expenditure, have had to pack up and leave to other jurisdictions where they don't have to pay a lot for security, whether it is use of cameras or security guards on foot patrol, or whatever other means they have to use for security. And the other prohibitive cost has been the cost of energy. All of the territories with which comparisons have been made, and I won't do them now, I won't say all, we're not at all competitive for many reasons, including just the movement in the cost of the base fuel for energy. And on top of that, this very ugly culture of people stealing electricity, and perhaps not enough partnership between the police and now the majority owners of shares in JPS to go after the individuals and to arrest them. So paying customers continue to pay handsomely for people who steal electricity. Let me go to a break.
At the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service, we're driven by service excellence. Visit mof.gov.jm for more information.
We continue to exist with a most uncomfortable situation where legitimate paying customers have to pay for electricity that is stolen by others. And it goes back to the political affiliation with several communities, and especially at election time, it becomes difficult for any politician, any MP who desires the vote of any community to say to the police, no, go ahead and remove the wires and let the people pay. They just can't do that. It is not politically convenient for that to be done. And at any rate, even if the police go in and remove the wires, sometimes by the time they leave, the wires are thrown back up. So we have this awfully ugly thing that has not been dealt with. And I do not even know exactly how it is going to be dealt with. I know that there have been attempts to put in sort of prepaid supply in a number of houses, and people have been signing up. So perhaps there is a dwindling of the numbers who are stealing electricity, but still it is an unhealthy percentage of individuals who steal, and that remains substantially unanswered. But on top of that, just the overwhelming cost of energy generally. There is no country that is going to achieve sufficient levels of growth where the recurrent expenditure of either residential or commercial premises, recurrent expenditure is such a high call on the books monthly. So any government having responsibility for this portfolio has to be bullish, as Darrell Vaz has been. And I completely reject any explicit or implicit argument that the license that we have with JPS is supposed to be a marriage from which one cannot obtain a divorce. Because if that is to be accepted, then forget the possibility of revocation of license if things are not being done according to the contract. And this is not just a mere contract. This is something that is gazetted. So when you're looking for the license between JPS and the government of Jamaica, you won't find a simple contract. It is a document that has legal force, so it is gazetted. They sue and can be sued on it pursuant to the Electric Lighting Act because it comes under a law of Parliament. It so happens that the notice period required by the grantor of the license to the licensee, that is the government of Jamaica, who is granted this license on a recommendation by the Office of Utilities Regulation and so forth, they need to give notice to the licensee, in this case JPS, within 2 years of the expiration of the license, notice of their intention not to extend on the current conditions. And I do not see why any notification, especially because the minister is acting pursuant to a statutory, therefore a public power, I don't see why that notice is to be given in silence. It needs to be absolutely loud as it has been, especially because potential suppliers, potential generators, potential distributors, potential transmitters of electricity who understand the conditions under which JPS now operates and its base source, its attempts to diversify, they need to be able to look at what they can offer and be willing and ready when the process is open to make whatever bids are necessary in the negotiating process. They have to do that. So the notice to JPS cannot be secret. It is merely coincidental now that we are on the verge of a general election and the notice is given. In my view, it is not to be read as anything that is political, but if, as I heard Minister Vaz saying yesterday, if the notice period passed and the notice wasn't given to JPS, then we'd be really stuck with the conditions extended some years ago, continuing in new license. And we cannot afford that. On top of that, it is really not difficult for me to conceptualize and imagine that there are perhaps potential investors looking on and seeing the upward trajectory of Jamaica in so many ways and looking to see, how can I invest in this country? I can give the people better bang for their buck in terms of electricity, and I can still make a profit out of all of this. Right? I hear all sorts of concerns about the payout that the government of Jamaica may have to do because of the ownership of the whole infrastructure and architecture by JPS. The very license speaks to it, and I don't see why we need to be afraid of it. Right? Frankly, if JPS is not the preferred licensee because there are other entities that have put forward better terms and conditions under which they can supply, transmit, and distribute, then what I know for sure is they cannot pick up the infrastructure that has been put down and walk with it. They can't put it in any other country, right? So it would serve them well for the fair market value which the contract provides for, the license provides for, to be determined by independent valuation experts. And then it would be appropriate, if they are not the preferred licensee at the end of the negotiating process, when the fair market value is determined, for the government to organize whatever payment scheme is to be organized, and they can be paid for the infrastructure which can then be sold to whoever the preferred licensee is, and they can build on the existing structure. Government need not, even if a valuator says it's going to cost government, let's say $2 trillion US, because I hear this figure floating around by a political party that has put out a manifesto. If that is the ridiculous figure that is put out for the fair market value, government need not find it out of government's coffers to pay, because government will then be open to engaging with the other licensee can literally agree to pay that sum, or indeed, perhaps we don't need one licensee anymore. The argument I know has been advanced that Jamaica is too small and our energy use is really not that large in comparison to other territories. And I see in the paper in The Observer a couple of days ago that Keith Collister cites the situation of Ireland. Ireland is of a similar size population to Jamaica, but Ireland's energy consumption was at one time about 10 times Jamaica's, and our energy consumption has not really grown much since the early 2000s or so forth, whereas Ireland has grown significantly. So the argument has been raised that based on not really population size but energy usage, it may not be economically feasible for more than one licensee to come in and to do what needs to be done. I think in this negotiating stage, it is worth considering whether this issue remains or not. But I'd certainly love to be able to see whether we can have one licensee making proposals to go underground. Yeah? Portmore, for example, which is a substantially large dormitory community, now a parish. Yeah? Is it possible for a licensee to be generating supply going underground for just that area as a test case? Yeah? Are there cluster parishes where another licensee can be granted a license to do whatever it is and completely change or to build on what is now existing? Because I know that there has been and there are now existing communities where overhead and underground coexist. There are some complexes where they have only underground supply. And especially with the ferocity of the hurricanes that we're having, because of the climate change conditions and the force of the winds that we're getting, we should be now open to having an entity that is willing to put up the infrastructural cost to go underground and supply substantially cheaper electricity to the people of Jamaica, and they can still get a return on their investment. All this overhead business has led to a massive uglification of the country. Large portions of the country, everywhere you go you see wire trope. When the thing is overground, there's space for wire to throw up. When it go underground, it would be extremely difficult for people to steal electricity. So, Darrell Vaz, your bombast is quite appropriate in this instance. And anybody who tells us that we must seek to renegotiate a license solely with JPS, they've lost the plot, because they're clearly not seeing what is going on. JPS is not to be excluded, but so must all of the other potential investors out there. Never be afraid of the cost. The very contract, the very license has built in this particular situation that we're up against. It means that we entered in with our eyes wide open, that perhaps somewhere down the road a divorce is possible. And when a divorce is possible, then we deal with the assets of the marriage and we split it as necessary. Yeah? I'm fascinated with this period. And I think anybody who is not, really check yourself.
Join us next time for Emily's Views on the Hotline.